So this video is going to give us a little bit of background about the French Revolution. And first we want to look at the status of the monarch. So right now we're talking about Louis the 15th, the grandson of Louis the 14th, and he is a much weaker king than Louis the 14th. Remember, Louis the 14th was the quintessential absolute monarch, right? The Sun King exercised significant control over the nobility. We're going to see a lot of that kind of fade away under Louis the 15th. Part of it is because Louis the 15th becomes king at a very young age. He becomes king at the age of 5. And when he's so young, the nobility gains significant influence over him. But even when he becomes king, his ministers and mistresses exercise some significant influence over him. All right, so the ministers are the people that work for him, and the mistresses are exactly what they sound like. Louis was kind of a ladies' man, and some of the women that he was involved with, actually kind of pressured him to make certain political decisions. So his most famous mistress was a woman named Madame de Pompadour, and she actually convinced Louis about many of the people that he appointed to powerful political offices, and she also influenced him in terms of foreign policy. In fact, she is blamed for getting France involved in the Seven Years' War, which turns out to be very expensive, and it's one of the major reasons why France is in such a precarious position on the eve of the revolution. Financial problems are a huge cause of the French Revolution. So basically, because of the increasing influence of the nobility and the people that work for him and his mistresses, we see that Louis himself has very little actual power over who he's appointing, and even in terms of foreign policy. All right, so we also need to think about how Louis is struggling with the Parlement of Paris. Now remember, the Parlement of Paris is different from the Parliament, like what we have in England. Okay, the Parlement is a judicial body, so it's a high court. Okay, but in England, the Parliament is a legislative body, so they're actually in charge of making laws. Um, but still, nonetheless, we see that what Parlement does is now, because the king is more of an absolute ruler at this period, he makes what's called decrees, right? He basically makes decisions about what to do, right? I decide to raise this tax. Um, I decide to declare war on this country, whatever. Okay, that's a decree. It's a king's decision, kind of an absolute decision. But still, the Parlement of Paris can approve or disapprove of his decrees. So that's why it's a judicial body. It kind of has a check on some of the king's decisions. All right. So the Parlement of Paris is kind of gaining power once we get into Louis the 15th reign. All right. Under Louis the 14th, many members of the Parlement of Paris were middle class, but they start to work their way up to the nobility by purchasing their titles. Remember the nobility of the robe? These were people that purchased their noble titles. Okay, so by the time we get to Louis the 15th's reign, we have many nobles who are members of the Parlement. So they want to have more influence in politics than they had under Louis the 14th, where they had virtually no political power whatsoever. Okay, so what Louis is doing that causes a clash between him and the Parlement is he needs to deal with this significant debt that France has accumulated. First off, during the wars of Louis the 14th, so he inherits debt, but also through the War of Austrian Succession and for the Seven Years' War. Okay, so France has been at war a lot recently and it needs to pay for it. Okay, so he he tries to raise taxes to pay for these wars, and Parlement says no, right? I mean, at this point, realize that that nobles have some privileges. They are traditionally exempt from taxes. We're going to talk about that in a little while with the three estates of France, but just realize that Parlement doesn't want to suddenly have to pay taxes. Okay, so they refuse. And what we see is that Louis the 15th is in a similar situation to what James the First and Charles the First were in about a century earlier, leading up to the English Civil War, right? So it's what turns England into a constitutional monarchy. Basically, the monarch can't get this judicial body to approve of these taxes. So what happens is the Parlement states that the king cannot levy taxes without the consent of Parlement. Um, so we also see that many people, many educated people and Enlightenment philosophes are very excited about the Parliament's action here. They support the Parliament pretty significantly, and it also shows us that the king's influence over Parliament, as well as his subjects that are educated, is declining, right? So Louis has to respond to this. And so what he does is he appoints a new chancellor. It's a man named René de Mapu. And what he is trying to do through this new chancellor is figure out how to subdue the Parlement, get rid of this judicial opposition so that he can go ahead and raise those taxes. Okay, so what Mapu does is he abolishes the Parlement of Paris, and he has the members exiled to isolated areas in French provinces. Okay, so they're all gone. All right, he appoints a new Parlement of Paris, and he makes sure that all of the members are very docile. In other words, they aren't going to disapprove of Louis XV's decrees. Okay, so what this results in is that the privileged groups are now going to be taxed. Okay, but obviously this is going to cause some pretty significant resentment of between the people and the monarch. All right, not just the members of the old Parlement who were exiled, but all those educated philosophes and the educated public. They don't like the new Parlement. They don't like royal authority. They don't like Louis XV. They don't like René de Mapu. And they're going to side with the old Parlement, right? Because they thought that the old Parlement was a really important check on the king's power. They want more representation, right? They're kind of tired of this absolute monarchy. But what we're going to see is that, okay, after Louis XV dies, we have Louis XVI become king in 1774. And he actually is trying to appease some of the people that were upset about the dismissal of the old Parlement, all right? Um, so he actually reinstates the members of the old Parlement, um, and he fires Mapu. Okay, so what we see is that at first the public is really kind of hopeful. They think that they might get a more representative government, but we're going to see as time goes on that they are ultimately disappointed by this because of a number of reasons. Kind of financial mismanagement being one of the most important ones. Louis needs to raise taxes just like Louis XV did, and we're going to see how that leads to some significant clashes between the monarch and his people. Let's start to review the kind of social order of France leading up to the revolution in 1789. All right, so just realize that France was a very advanced country by the 18th century. Okay, it has a population of nearly 25 million people. It's the wealthiest country in Europe. However, this is not per capita. All right, so this means that not every person has the exact same amount of wealth, but the country as a whole is incredibly wealthy. All right, so we have peasants that are extremely poor, and we're going to talk about how that's one of the reasons why this this old order, which I'm going to outline in a second, is not really going to work for modern France. Okay, France has a very productive economy. It actually has the most significant culture in the continent of Europe as well. French is a language that's spoken more than any other language in Europe. It's the language of diplomacy. It's spoken in most European courts. France also, remember, was the center of Enlightenment ideas. French science is sort of leading the world, and France also has the most powerful military in Europe in 1789. So unfortunately, because France is very advanced, but we see that its social order is not so advanced. So what do I mean by that? Well, France is broken up into three different estates, okay, three different social classes. So it's kind of a remnant of medieval France. It's not really reflecting what France is like at this point, okay? So the first estate is the clergy. Okay, it only represents 1% of the population, but it owns about 20% of the land. So just think about that imbalance there. Also, the clergy members are exempt from taxation. Okay, the nobility makes up the second estate. Okay, this is about 2 to 4% of the population. They too are exempt from taxation. Okay, they own about 25% of the land. All right, and remember again, the nobility has experienced a pretty significant resurgence since the death of Louis XV. All right, they have a lot of manorial rights, so they are allowed to tax the peasants, for example, for their own profit. So the first two estates you can see represent not that much of the population, but own a lot of land and don't have to pay taxes. Okay, but the third estate, this represents everyone else. Okay, so in other words, the third estate is very diverse economically. We have 97% of the population falling into the third estate. So some of them are actually quite wealthy. Rich merchants, professionals, lawyers, basically the middle class all fits into the third estate, all right? But we also have peasants falling into the third estate, all right? And all of them, regardless of how much money they have to pay the majority of the tax burden. All right, they have to pay what's called a land tax, a tithe, which is a land tax. They have to pay a tax to the church, which is called a tithe. Okay, they have to pay about 10% of their annual income to the church. They pay an income tax, they pay taxes on salt. Right, so basically, the peasants are paying almost all the taxes, even though you already saw that the nobility and the clergy own quite a bit of land. They actually own more than half of the land, right? Peasants own about 40% of the land, but they occupy nearly all of France. So, they live on more land than they actually own, right? Um, so the second estate also, like I was saying earlier, they tax the third estate for their own profit. They also take advantage of this thing called the corvée, which was that peasants had to work for nobles for several days a year and they were not paid. Nobles also could use these things called hunting rights. So basically, they could hunt on peasants' land, and the peasants couldn't do anything to stop that. All right, so what you're going to see is that the peasants, they're not exactly serfs per se. That would be too extreme. That's much more like what it is in Eastern Europe. But the peasants really, they are burdened significantly in terms of taxes, which is going to make it really difficult for them to afford basic things like food. And when we get to the French Revolution, we're going to see how significant that is. But an even more important group in the third estate is the bourgeoisie, all right? And that's because they are making up the middle class, right? They have quite a bit of money, all right? And they think that because they are economically powerful, that it's not fair, that they don't have any political power, right? They think that they should have just as much political power as they do economic power, all right? So because of that, they look at the first and second estate who have all of those tax exemptions and who also will tax the third estate, right? The church makes them pay a tithe, remember, and the nobility can also exercise taxes over the third estate, and they can hunt on their land, all these things. So basically, the bourgeoisie is going to increasingly resent the first and second estate. So they think that the solution to this problem is to reduce the privileges for the nobility and to give some tax relief to the bourgeoisie and maybe even introduce some taxes to the nobility. All right, so by the eve of the French Revolution, we start to see that there is a pretty significant amount of diversity between the third estates. So since it's about the 15-minute limit, we'll pick back up with the second part in just a few minutes.